whose coworkers use the most drugs and which ones are they taking? So I'm curious as to what your guesses are because when I asked my husband before I actually looked into the results myself, we both came up with the top two answers. So the one that I came up with was chef. And basically what we find is that, yeah, the food industry is rampant with drug use. Now, I may have been slightly swayed by this because I have an kind of unhealthy obsession with Anthony Bourdain, and he had written a lot about how many drugs and what different types were used in the food service industry. And this did not come as a shock to my husband, who was once a pizza delivery person, and his job actually got raided because they were selling coke out of it. Yeah, lots of drugs in the food service industry. But then he was able to guess the second one, and the second one with the most drugs in it is the construction industry. What we see is that there's three specific jobs that have like incredibly high drug use. And the number one are roofers. Number two are drywall installers, and number three are painters, which when I asked him this, he got all three in that row. So apparently there is a very specific stereotype here. Now, what we see is that the drugs that they use are actually kind of different depending on the industry. So what you see is that alcohol is far more common in construction industries, as well as places like mining. And so in some of those industries, about 1 out of every 5 people have heavy alcohol use. In hotels and in the food service industry, you see more of that illegal drug use. We see construction and food service are for sure numbers 1 and 2, but what are some of the other big industries? Well, there's a clear number 3, and that is transportation. Specifically truck drivers, yeah, a lot of them are using drugs, which makes sense when you think about what you need to do in a lot of these roles. So in food service, you are working on your feet for long periods of time. As a chef, you're awake all hours. Like, it is a constantly overworked job. And truck drivers have a lot of the same strain. Like, they need to be out there for long periods of time driving and staying awake, and that requires a lot of energy, and it's very easy to get tired when you're on the open road for long periods of time. So you see a lot of like amphetamine use in those groups. My dad's a truck driver, so I've been on a lot of the long haul trips, and let me say the things that you see in truck stops, not great. Now, we also see other types of drug use that are more specific in other types of industries. So, for example, healthcare, we see a lot of drug use among like hospice workers and like personal care aides and like CNAs. But then there's also a very specific drug use problem that we see with healthcare workers. And this is because they have a lot of access to these types of things like prescriptions. I'm going to do an entire video about this specifically, but drug use in healthcare is like a very niche issue, but a very real one. The last big industry that's kind of known for drug use is farming and fishing, which I also could have guessed because I've watched enough Deadliest Catch, and that is for sure an accurate representation of everything that goes on in that industry. Yeah, we see a lot of alcohol use in that community, but also lots of other different types of drugs too. Because again, you're out for long periods of time. It is like painful to your body. Like, you are away from other people except for the small group of people for long periods of time, and it is dangerous work. So a lot of people cope with drugs for that. Now, the industries that had kind of lower rates of drug use were sales, which made me side-eye a little bit, but also teachers, which kind of makes sense and according to like the wholesome teacher sense of things. But I don't know if that is just because they're not self-reporting or what's going on here. And that's the problem. Like, how do we actually get this information? So some of these statistics come from things like drug testing. So what we see is that if you just like drug test a whole bunch of people, about 6% of them will come up with a positive drug test at the moment. So not 6% of people, but 6% of drug tests. And that tells us what people are more likely to use. So for example, the most popular thing that comes up in drug tests is weed, perhaps unsurprising. Like, we're talking about like 40% of the positive drug tests are for weed. Amphetamines are number 2, but this is kind of misleading because in a lot of these cases for amphetamines and things like benzos and opioids, which also show up a lot of times they're actually just prescription drugs. So this is things like ADHD medication. But then the number 2 in terms of illegal drugs, or illegal-ish drugs, because weed is federally illegal but statewide legal, is cocaine. The problem with looking at this data from like the perspective of drug testing is a lot of people are not drug tested. So for example, I have never been drug tested in my life and I'm a drug scientist. So like, you're never going to see the actual results just based on drug testing because you're missing entire like industries that never do drug testing. And another way that they do drug testing is for when somebody has like an accident and they're trying to figure out like, were they under the influence of something? Like, did that cause the accident? Now, In a lot of cases, it seemed to. So what they see is that when they do testing for that, about 95% of the tests come back positive for something. So when you suspect that somebody is on drugs, they actually were in a lot of cases. But then when you look at things like pre-employment screens, as well as just like the random drug testing that people do, you see a much lower percentage. So rehab centers, much higher percentage of the people who are testing positive. So the problem is that this is going to be very biased data. The other sources of data that we have also very biased. So, for example, we can do things like see when people die, which industry that they were in. So if they overdosed on a drug, which industry were they in, and that can help us figure out which industries use the most drugs. But that only typically tells us about drugs that are likely to cause overdoses. So for example, you are not likely to see anyone die from a weed overdose, like just has not happened yet. So you're going to miss all of that data if your industry primarily uses weed and does not use things that are likely to cause overdose. So drug testing is flawed. You're only getting certain groups of people who are actually drug testing. And then you also have things like synthetic urine and all of the problems with drug testing in general. And then you have drug overdose, but that data is flawed. That only gives us a little portion of the information. And then other people are like, well, you can just ask people. And we do ask people, like we do have self-report where we ask people what industry they're in and how many drugs they use. And what we see is that on average, about 9% of people say that they drink heavily and about 9% of them admit to using illegal drugs. And this depends on the industry they're in. So again, you have the same industries, construction and food service, number 1 and 2, pretty much every time. And we actually see that rates of drug use are decreasing among construction workers and miners, but they're increasing in the education field. Don't know what's going on with that. Maybe it's just a more terrible place to be recently, which as somebody who loves the addition of AI to college teaching, I feel that. So this is a way for us to see which ones are increasing and decreasing, but this is all based on self-reports. So if you're in a field in which using drugs really matters, so if you're like a police officer or if you're a doctor, you're less likely to report this because this could have you lose your job. And then like, how are we having people self-report their industry? So we'd probably guess that there'd be high rates of drug use among like musicians, for example, but like, do a lot of musicians report their main industry as a musician? Because I know a lot of people who do music as like a side gig type of thing. So you're gonna have like a reduced sample size there. Like there are all sorts of problems with this, but in general, we do see that construction workers and food service people, y'all use a lot of drugs.